When words collide, the fluorescent lights of Studio 6A hummed with their usual electrical buzz as makeup artists applied final touches to the hosts of The View. It was a crisp October morning in Manhattan, and the energy in the studio was particularly charged. Today's show would feature a controversial political segment that had been weeks in the making. Whoopi Goldberg sat in her familiar spot at the curved table, reviewing her notes one last time. Her reading glasses perched on the edge of her nose as she scanned the teleprompter script. The topic of discussion was immigration policy, and the guest appearing via satellite was Senator Tommy Tuberville from Alabama, known for his conservative stance and distinctive Southern drawl. 5 minutes to air, called out Jake Morrison, the show's director, his voice cutting through the pre-show chatter. The studio audience, composed mainly of tourists and longtime fans, settled into their seats with anticipation. Sarah Chen, a 28-year-old production assistant, nervously adjusted her headset as she coordinated between the control room and the floor. This was only her third month working on the show, having moved to New York from Portland after graduating with a communications degree. She had dreamed of working in television, but the reality of live broadcasting was proving more stressful than she had imagined. "Whoopi, we need you to test your mic one more time," Sarah requested, approaching the host's chair with professional courtesy despite her inner nervousness. Whoopi looked up from her notes, her expression already showing signs of the intensity she brought to political discussions. "Testing, testing," she said into her lapel microphone, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had been in this business for decades. In the control room, executive producer Rebecca Martinez watched the multiple screens showing different camera angles. At 45, Rebecca had worked her way up through the ranks of daytime television, and she knew when a show had the potential to generate significant buzz and controversy. Today felt like one of those days. "Camera 2, tighten on Whoopi for the opening," Rebecca instructed through her headset. "And make sure we have a good clean feed from Alabama. The last thing we need is technical difficulties during a heated political discussion." The countdown began. 3, 2, 1. The familiar theme music filled the studio as the show went live. Whoopi delivered her opening monologue with her characteristic blend of humor and sharp political commentary, setting the stage for what would become a defining moment in her career. "Today we're discussing the ongoing immigration debate," Whoopi announced to the cameras, her voice steady but carrying an undertone of the passion she felt about the subject. "And joining us from Montgomery, Alabama, is Senator Tommy Tuberville, who has been quite vocal about his position on border security." The satellite feed connected, and Senator Tuberville appeared on the large monitor to Whoopi's right. At 69, the former football coach turned politician maintained the confident demeanor that had served him well in both careers. His office in Montgomery was visible behind him, decorated with University of Auburn memorabilia and American flags. "Good morning, Senator Tuberville," Whoopi began, her tone professional but with a slight edge that regular viewers would recognize as her preparation for verbal combat. "Well, good morning to y'all from down here in Sweet Home, Alabama," Tuberville responded, his accent thick and unmistakably Southern. "I appreciate y'all having me on the show today." In the control room, Rebecca noticed Whoopi's facial expression change slightly, a subtle shift that suggested she was about to deviate from the planned script. After years of working with the host, Rebecca had learned to recognize these moments. "Senator," Whoopi continued, "before we get into policy, I have to ask, do you think that accent of yours helps or hurts when you're trying to discuss serious national issues?" The studio fell silent. Even the usually chatty audience seemed to sense that something significant had just happened. Sarah, standing just off camera, felt her stomach drop as she realized this wasn't in the script. Tuberville's expression remained calm, but those watching closely could see a slight tightening around his eyes. Years of coaching had taught him to remain composed under pressure, and decades in Alabama politics had prepared him for exactly this type of confrontation. "Ma'am," he said slowly, his voice carrying a new weight, "I reckon my accent represents about 5 million Alabamians who sent me to Washington to speak for them. But since we're talking about how we sound rather than what we have to say, maybe that tells your viewers something about the priorities here." The comeback was delivered with such measured precision that it caught everyone off guard. Whoopi, known for her quick wit and ability to dominate conversations, found herself momentarily speechless. The studio audience, which had been murmuring after her initial comment, fell completely silent. Rebecca leaned forward in the control room, knowing that this moment would likely define the entire segment and possibly much more. The silence in Studio 6A stretched for what felt like an eternity, but was actually only 7 seconds. 7 seconds that would be replayed countless times across social media and news networks. Whoopi's usually quick recovery seemed delayed as she processed the unexpected eloquence of Tuberville's response. "Well," she finally managed, attempting to regain her composure, "let's talk about the immigration policies you support, Senator." But the damage was done. The remainder of the interview proceeded with a tension that was palpable both in the studio and to viewers at home. Tuberville answered policy questions with the same measured precision he had used in his comeback, while Whoopi seemed slightly off her usual commanding pace. As soon as the show cut to commercial, the studio erupted in whispered conversations. Sarah Chen stood frozen at her position, watching as crew members exchanged glances that seemed to say, "Did that really just happen?" "That was," began Joy Behar, leaning over to Whoopi during the break. "I know," Whoopi cut her off, her voice tight. "I know." In the control room, Rebecca Martinez was already fielding calls. Her phone had started ringing before the segment even ended, and she could see notifications lighting up her computer screen like a Christmas tree. "Rebecca, this is blowing up online already," called out Marcus Thompson, the show's social media coordinator. At 24, Marcus had an intuitive understanding of how content moved through digital spaces. "Twitter is going crazy. The clip is already being shared faster than anything we've posted this month." The show continued, but everyone could feel the shift in energy. What should have been a routine political interview had transformed into something much more significant, and the ramifications were already beginning to unfold. After the show wrapped, Whoopi retreated to her dressing room without her usual post-show discussions with producers. Sarah, still processing what she had witnessed, was tasked with collecting audience feedback cards, a routine part of her job that today felt anything but routine. "Excuse me," said an older woman from the audience as Sarah gathered the cards. "I've been coming to tapings here for 15 years, and I've never seen anything quite like that." "What did you think?" Sarah asked, her professional curiosity overriding her nervousness. "Honestly, I came here expecting to see the senator get torn apart. But he handled himself with more grace than I expected, made me think differently about making assumptions." This sentiment was echoed in multiple feedback cards. While some audience members supported Whoopi's approach, a surprising number commented on Tuberville's dignified response and questioned whether mocking someone's regional accent was appropriate on national television. Meanwhile, in Montgomery, Alabama, Senator Tuberville's office was experiencing its own chaos. His communications director, Jennifer Walsh, a 34-year-old political operative who had worked on campaigns across the South, was fielding interview requests from major networks. "Senator, CNN wants you for tonight's prime time," Jennifer reported as Tuberville returned to his office after the satellite interview. "Fox News is asking for an exclusive. And honestly, sir, my phone hasn't stopped ringing since you went off the air." Tuberville loosened his tie and sat behind his desk, the weight of the moment settling in. "Jenny, what's the word from back home?" "Sir, the response from Alabama has been overwhelmingly positive. People are saying you stood up for the state with class." But it's not just Alabama. I'm getting messages from all over the South, and honestly, from people who might not usually agree with your politics, but respect how you handled yourself. Back in New York, the atmosphere at The View was increasingly tense. Rebecca had called an emergency meeting with the senior production staff, something that hadn't happened in the 3 years since she had taken over as executive producer. "Okay, people, let's address this head-on," Rebecca began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had navigated numerous television crises. "We have a situation that's escalating rapidly, and we need to decide how to handle it." Marcus pulled up his laptop, displaying real-time social media analytics. The video clip has been viewed over 2 million times in the past 4 hours. The comments are polarizing. "We're getting criticism from some unexpected quarters." "What kind of criticism?" asked Linda Rodriguez, the show's senior writer, who had been with the program for 8 years and had seen her share of controversial moments. "Well, it's not just the usual political divide," Marcus explained. "We're seeing comments from people saying that mocking regional accents crosses a line, that it's a form of discrimination. Some are comparing it to mocking other forms of speech differences." Sarah, who had been quietly taking notes in the corner, found herself thinking about her own background. Growing up in Portland, she had always considered herself progressive and inclusive. But witnessing the exchange, and now hearing the response, she was beginning to question whether there was something problematic about what had happened. "Ma'am," she said hesitantly, addressing Rebecca, "I've been reading some of the feedback from today's audience. It's not what we expected." Rebecca looked up from her notes. "What are you seeing, Sarah?" "A lot of people are saying that Senator Tuberville handled himself well, and that maybe we crossed a line. Some are saying it made them think about their own biases regarding Southern accents and stereotypes." The room fell quiet as everyone processed this information. It was one thing to generate controversy. That was sometimes part of the business. But creating a situation where their own audience began questioning the show's approach was more serious. "What about the network?" asked Linda. "What's their position?" Rebecca sighed. "They're concerned. This isn't just about ratings or social media buzz. They're worried about the broader implications, especially if this becomes a bigger story about media bias and regional stereotyping." As the day progressed, it became clear that this was indeed becoming a much bigger story. News outlets across the political spectrum were picking up the clip, but the analysis was more nuanced than anyone had expected. By Thursday morning, the Whoopi versus Tuberville clip had taken on a life of its own. Cable news networks were running segments analyzing not just the political implications, but the cultural and social dynamics of what had transpired. Academic experts on linguistics and regional identity were being brought in to discuss the broader context of accent discrimination in American media. Dr. Patricia Williams, a sociolinguistics professor at Columbia University, found herself in the unusual position of being a hot media commodity. Her research on accent bias had been academic for years, but suddenly everyone wanted to understand the deeper implications of what had happened on The View. "What we witnessed," Dr. Williams explained during an interview on CNN, was a perfect example of how regional accents, particularly Southern accents, are often used as shorthand for intelligence or credibility. It's a form of linguistic prejudice that we don't often discuss openly. In Alabama, the response continued to be overwhelmingly supportive of their senator. Coffee shops in Montgomery, Birmingham, and Mobile were buzzing with conversations about how Tuberville had represented the state. But the reaction was spreading beyond Alabama's borders. Maria Gonzalez, a high school English teacher in rural Georgia, found herself using the incident as a teaching moment for her students. "Class," she said during her first period, "I want you to watch this clip and think about what it tells us about assumptions we make based on how people speak." Her students, a diverse mix of kids from farming families and suburban transplants, watched the exchange with intense focus. After it ended, hands shot up around the room. "Ms. Gonzalez," said Tyler, a senior whose family had farmed in the area for generations. "My dad talks just like that senator. Does that mean people think he's stupid when he goes to Atlanta for business?" "That's exactly the kind of question we need to be asking," Maria responded. "How might our assumptions about accents affect how we treat people?" Ashley, whose family had moved from Ohio when her father took a job at a local manufacturing plant, raised her hand. "I never thought about it before. But when we first moved here, I probably did make assumptions about people based on how they talked. That's not fair, is it?" Similar conversations were happening in classrooms, workplaces, and homes across the country. What had started as a brief television exchange was evolving into a broader cultural discussion about prejudice, respect, and the way Americans from different regions perceived each other. Meanwhile, Sarah Chen was experiencing her own transformation. As the production assistant who had witnessed the exchange firsthand, she found herself thinking deeply about her own attitudes and assumptions. That evening, she called her former college roommate Jessica, who had moved back to her hometown in rural Kentucky after graduation. "Jess, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me," Sarah began after they had caught up on basic life updates. "Shoot," Jessica replied, her own Kentucky accent noticeable even over the phone. "When you were at school in Portland, did you ever feel like people treated you differently because of your accent?" There was a pause before Jessica answered. "Sarah, why are you asking?" Sarah explained what had happened on the show and her growing realization that she might have been part of a system that discriminated against people based on regional speech patterns. "To answer your question," Jessica said slowly, "yes, I absolutely did. I remember my first week at college, I said something in our dorm meeting, and this girl from San Francisco immediately asked if I was, like, super religious, and if I believed in evolution, just because of how I talked. Oh my God, Jess, I'm so sorry. Did I ever?" "No, you didn't. But you also never really understood when I tried to explain how frustrating it was. You kind of brushed it off as no big deal." Sarah felt a wave of guilt and recognition. "I'm starting to understand now. And I'm really sorry I didn't get it before." Back at The View, the production team was grappling with how to address the situation. Friday's show was approaching, and they knew they would have to acknowledge what had happened. The question was how. Rebecca had spent hours on calls with network executives, legal counsel, and crisis management consultants. The consensus was that they needed to address the situation head-on, but the approach was still being debated. "We have several options," Rebecca explained to her team during their Thursday afternoon meeting. "We can double down and defend Whoopi's approach as legitimate political commentary. We can issue a formal apology. Or we can use this as an opportunity for a broader discussion about media responsibility and regional bias." Linda Rodriguez, the senior writer, had been working on different versions of potential responses. "I've been thinking about this a lot," she said. "What if we're missing the real story here? What if this isn't just about one exchange, but about how we, in media centers like New York and Los Angeles, sometimes approach people from other parts of the country?" Marcus, monitoring social media trends, looked up from his laptop. "The conversation online is evolving. It started as political, but now it's becoming more about respect and representation. People are sharing their own stories about accent discrimination." "What kind of stories?" Rebecca asked. "Everything from job interviews where people felt they had to change their accents, to college experiences where they were made to feel less intelligent because of how they spoke. It's actually pretty eye-opening." Whoopi, who had been largely silent during these discussions, finally spoke up. "I never intended for this to become about accent discrimination. I was trying to make a political point." But intent and impact are different things, Sarah said quietly, surprising herself by speaking up in the meeting. I've been thinking about this a lot since Tuesday, and I'm realizing that maybe the impact is more important than what we intended. Rebecca looked at Sarah with interest. Go on. Well, I keep thinking about that audience member who said it made her reconsider her assumptions. What if we could turn this into something positive? What if we could have a real conversation about these issues instead of just trying to make this go away? Meanwhile, Senator Tuberville was facing his own decisions about how to respond to the continued attention. His staff was advising him to capitalize on the moment politically, but the former coach was thinking about something different. Jenny, he said to his communications director, what if instead of doing more combative interviews, we focused on something constructive? What do you mean, sir? I mean, what if we use this attention to actually talk about the real issues facing Alabama and the South? Economic development, education, infrastructure, the things that matter to people regardless of how they talk. Jennifer Walsh had worked in politics long enough to know that this kind of opportunity didn't come along often. Most politicians would use the momentum for maximum political advantage, but she was seeing something different in her boss's approach. That's a more challenging path, sir, but potentially more meaningful in the long run. Sometimes the right thing and the easy thing aren't the same, Jenny. I learned that coaching, and it applies to politics too. As Thursday evening approached, all the key players were preparing for what would happen next. The story had grown beyond any of their expectations, and the choices they made in the coming days would determine whether this moment would be remembered as just another political spat or as something that actually contributed to a better understanding between Americans from different backgrounds. Friday morning brought an unusual energy to Studio 6A. The show's producers had decided to dedicate the entire opening segment to addressing what had happened earlier in the week, and word had leaked to the media. The studio audience was different too. Instead of the usual mix of tourists and longtime fans, there were journalists, academics, and people who had specifically requested tickets to witness how the show would handle the controversy. Sarah Chen arrived at work 2 hours early, her stomach tight with anxiety. She had barely slept, thinking about the conversation she'd had with Rebecca the previous evening. The executive producer had asked Sarah to research similar incidents in television history, and what she had found was both enlightening and disturbing. Rebecca, Sarah had said during their late-night phone call, I found dozens of examples going back decades. Television hosts and news anchors regularly mocking Southern accents, often in ways that would be considered completely unacceptable if applied to other forms of speech differences or cultural backgrounds. Now, as Sarah watched the crew prepare for what everyone knew would be a pivotal show, she felt the weight of being part of an industry that had perpetuated harmful stereotypes for years. Whoopi arrived at the studio unusually early as well, and Sarah noticed that she looked tired. The usually confident host seemed subdued as she went through her morning routine with the makeup and wardrobe teams. Sarah, Whoopi called out as she settled into her chair for final preparations. I understand you've been doing some research on this situation. Yes, ma'am, Sarah replied, approaching with a folder of materials she had compiled. Tell me what you found. Sarah took a breath, knowing that this conversation could define her future with the show. Ms. Goldberg, I found that accent discrimination is more widespread and harmful than I ever realized. There are studies showing that people with Southern accents are often perceived as less intelligent, less credible, and less professional, regardless of their actual qualifications or expertise. Whoopi listened intently, her expression thoughtful. And you think that's what happened here? I think that maybe, without meaning to, we contributed to that pattern. And I think we have an opportunity to be part of changing it. Meanwhile, in Montgomery, Alabama, Senator Tuberville was preparing for his own significant moment. He had decided to hold a press conference that would be carried live by several national networks, timed to coincide with the View's broadcast. His communications director, Jennifer Walsh, had initially been skeptical of the timing, but she had come to understand her boss's strategy. Rather than simply responding to what happened on the show, he was going to use the platform to discuss broader issues of respect and representation in American political discourse. "Senator," Jennifer said as they reviewed his remarks one final time, "this is either going to be remembered as a masterful use of a difficult situation or it's going to backfire spectacularly." Tuberville finished with a slight smile. "But Jenny, sometimes you have to take the risk to do what's right. That's what leadership means." At 11 a.m. Eastern, both events began simultaneously. The View opened with Whoopi addressing the camera directly, her tone serious and reflective. "Earlier this week, during an interview with Senator Tommy Tuberville of Alabama, I made comments about his accent that I need to address," she began. "After taking time to reflect and listening to feedback from viewers, colleagues, and experts, I realized that my approach was problematic. The studio was unusually quiet, the audience sensing the gravity of the moment. I want to be clear about something," Whoopi continued. "I have spent my entire career fighting against discrimination and prejudice in all its forms, but this week I learned that I had a blind spot. Making assumptions about someone's intelligence or credibility based on their regional accent is a form of prejudice, and I participated in it." Meanwhile, in Montgomery, Senator Tuberville stood behind a podium in his Senate office, with Alabama and American flags flanking him on either side. "I want to thank the media for their attention this week," he began, his familiar accent clear and unashamed. "But I don't want to spend our time today talking about what was said about how I sound. I want to talk about what I'm saying, and more importantly, what the people of Alabama need their voices in Washington to accomplish." Both speakers continued their remarks, creating a fascinating split-screen moment for viewers who were watching both events. Whoopi was engaging in introspection and acknowledgement of harm, while Tuberville was demonstrating grace and redirecting attention to substantive issues. "I've learned this week that millions of Americans face discrimination based on their regional accents," Whoopi said. "That's not acceptable. And media personalities like myself have a responsibility to do better." At the same time, Tuberville was saying, "The people of Alabama sent me to Washington not because of how I sound, but because of what I stand for. And what I stand for is making sure that every American, regardless of where they're from or how they talk, has opportunities to succeed." Dr. Patricia Williams, the Columbia linguistics professor, was watching both feeds from her office, taking notes for what she knew would be a significant moment in her field's intersection with popular culture. "This is remarkable," she said during a phone interview with NPR that was being conducted while the events unfolded. "We're seeing real-time education and accountability around issues that academics have been studying for decades, but rarely penetrate mainstream consciousness." Back in Studio 6A, Whoopi was concluding her remarks with something that surprised even her production team. "I want to invite Senator Tuberville back on the show," she announced. "Not for a political debate, but for a conversation about how we can bridge divides in this country instead of widening them. And I want to commit to our viewers that we'll do better when it comes to treating all Americans with the respect they deserve, regardless of where they're from or how they speak." The response from the studio audience was immediate and sustained applause, but it was different from the usual enthusiastic cheering that The View typically generated. This applause felt more thoughtful, more meaningful. In Montgomery, Senator Tuberville was wrapping up his press conference with his own surprising announcement. "I accept Ms. Goldberg's invitation to return to her show," he said, though he had no way of knowing she had just extended it. "But I'd like to suggest we expand the conversation. What if we brought together Americans from different regions, different backgrounds, different political beliefs? to talk about what unites us instead of what divides us. Jennifer Walsh, standing off to the side, felt a sense of pride in her boss that went beyond political strategy. This was leadership in action, she realized, the ability to transform a moment of conflict into an opportunity for something constructive. Social media immediately exploded with reactions to both events. Marcus Thompson, monitoring feeds from the control room at The View, was amazed by what he was seeing. "Rebecca," he called out, "the response is unlike anything I've seen. People aren't just talking about the politics. They're sharing personal stories about accent discrimination, about making assumptions, about learning and growing." One tweet that particularly caught his attention came from a teacher in rural Mississippi. "Watching my students today as they realize they don't have to hide their accents to be taken seriously. This conversation matters more than people realize." Another, from a business executive in Atlanta, "I've been changing my accent in conference calls for 15 years. Maybe it's time to stop." As both events concluded, it was clear that something significant had shifted. What had started as a brief, uncomfortable television moment had evolved into a national conversation about respect, prejudice, and the ways Americans from different regions related to each other. Sarah Chen, watching from the studio floor, realized that she had witnessed something that might be studied in communications classes for years to come. But more importantly, she had learned something about herself and her own biases that would stay with her far longer than any job in television. 3 weeks later, Studio 6A was transformed for a special edition of The View. The usual setup had been expanded to accommodate a larger panel, with representatives from different regions of the country, various academic experts, and, as promised, Senator Tommy Tuberville appearing in person rather than via satellite. The intervening weeks had seen the story continue to evolve in unexpected ways. Universities across the country had organized discussions about linguistic prejudice. Companies had begun examining their own hiring practices to identify potential accent bias. Social media had become flooded with stories from people sharing their experiences with regional discrimination. Sarah Chen, who had been promoted to associate producer in recognition of her role in helping the show navigate the crisis constructively, stood backstage reviewing the final preparations. The past 3 weeks had been the most intense of her professional life, but also the most meaningful. "Are you nervous?" asked Dr. Patricia Williams, who would be joining the panel as an expert on linguistic bias. "Terrified," Sarah admitted, "but also excited. I feel like we have a chance to do something important here." Whoopi arrived at the studio with a different energy than she had displayed on that controversial Tuesday morning. The past weeks had involved extensive preparation, reading academic research, speaking with people from across the country about their experiences, and examining her own assumptions and biases. "Sarah," she said, approaching the young producer, "I want to thank you for the research you did and the courage you showed in speaking up. That's not always easy in this business." "Thank you, Ms. Goldberg. I learned a lot about myself in this process too." Oh. When Senator Tuberville arrived in New York the evening before the show, he was accompanied not just by his communications director, but by a small group of Alabamians from different backgrounds, a teacher, a small business owner, and a college student, who would be part of the panel discussion. "Senator," Jennifer Walsh said as they reviewed the planned format one more time, "I have to admit, when this all started, I thought it would be a one-day political story. I never imagined it would become this." Tuberville looked out the window of his Manhattan hotel room at the busy streets below. "Jenny, sometimes the most important conversations are the ones we don't plan to have." The morning of the special show, the audience was different yet again. Instead of the usual daytime television crowd, The studio was filled with educators, community leaders, and people who had been directly affected by the broader conversation about accent discrimination. Among them was Jessica, Sarah's college roommate from Kentucky, who had flown to New York specifically for the taping. Their phone conversation weeks earlier had sparked something in Jessica, a decision to be more open about her own experiences and to help others understand the impact of linguistic prejudice. As the show began, Whoopi addressed the cameras with a gravity that reflected how much the experience had changed her approach. 3 weeks ago, we had what could have been just another political argument on this show, she began. Instead, it became a learning experience for all of us, and hopefully for many of you watching. Today, we want to continue that conversation, but expand it. Senator Tuberville, seated at the panel for the first time in person, nodded as Whoopi spoke. The antagonism that had characterized their first interaction was completely absent, replaced by a mutual respect that had developed through their separate but parallel journeys of the past weeks. "Senator Tuberville," Whoopi said, turning to him, "you handled my comments with more grace than I deserved. What did you hope would come out of that moment?" "Ms. Goldberg," he replied, his accent clear and confident, "I hoped that people would focus less on how we sound and more on what we're actually trying to say to each other. But I'll be honest, I never expected it to turn into the kind of meaningful conversation we've seen across the country these past weeks." Dr. Williams, participating in the panel discussion, provided context for the broader issues at play. "What we've witnessed," she explained to the audience, "is a rare moment when a society becomes consciously aware of a form of prejudice that was previously largely unconscious. Accent discrimination affects millions of Americans, but it's rarely discussed openly." The panel included voices from across the regional spectrum. A tech executive from Silicon Valley who had grown up in rural Texas, a teacher from Boston whose students came from dozens of different linguistic backgrounds, and a journalist from Minnesota who had studied how media representation affects regional identity. "I want to share something personal," said Maria Santos, the teacher from Boston. "I grew up hearing my grandmother speak English with a heavy Portuguese accent. She was brilliant, but people often treated her as if she was ignorant because of how she sounded. When I became a teacher, I promised myself I would never make assumptions about my students based on how they spoke." The conversation that followed was unlike anything that had been seen on daytime television. Rather than the quick-paced, often superficial discussions that characterized most talk shows, this was a deep, thoughtful exploration of how Americans related to each other across regional and cultural lines. Jessica, Sarah's friend from Kentucky, was given an opportunity to speak from the audience about her own experiences. "I spent my first year of college trying to change how I talked," she said, her voice carrying the emotion of years of frustration. "I thought I had to sound different to be taken seriously. It wasn't until this conversation started happening that I realized how many other people had gone through the same thing." As the show progressed, something unexpected happened. Audience members began sharing their own stories, not just about accents, but about various forms of assumptions and prejudices they had experienced or participated in. A businessman from Chicago talked about assuming someone from Mississippi wouldn't understand complex financial concepts, only to discover that person had an MBA from Wharton. A teacher from Oregon shared how she had unconsciously called on students with standard accents more often than those with regional dialects. Senator Tuberville, who had initially been the target of what could have been seen as an attack, found himself in the role of facilitator, helping to guide the conversation toward constructive outcomes. "What I'm hearing," he said during one particularly emotional exchange, "is that we all have areas where we can grow in how we treat each other. The question is, what do we do with that knowledge?" Whoopi, who had spent her career as a provocateur and challenger, found herself in the unfamiliar but comfortable role of a learner and facilitator. "I think," she said, "we commit to doing better. We commit to checking our assumptions. We commit to listening more carefully to what people are actually saying instead of making judgments based on how they're saying it." The show concluded with commitments from various participants. The View pledged to be more conscious about regional representation and linguistic bias in their programming. Senator Tuberville announced a series of town halls in different regions to discuss bridging cultural and political divides. Dr. Williams shared plans for a new research initiative examining accent bias in professional settings. But perhaps the most significant commitment came from Sarah Chen, who announced that she would be starting a non-profit organization focused on media literacy and bias recognition, with a particular emphasis on regional and linguistic prejudice. "3 weeks ago, I was just a production assistant who thought I understood prejudice and discrimination," she said, addressing the cameras directly. "I learned that I had blind spots I didn't even know existed. If this conversation can help other people recognize their own blind spots and do something about them, then maybe something good can come from what started as a difficult moment." As the show ended and the audience filed out, the atmosphere was different from any television taping any of them had attended. Instead of the usual quick exit, people lingered, continuing conversations that had been started during the broadcast. Jessica approached Sarah after the taping, and they embraced with a warmth that had been missing from their friendship since college. "Thank you," Jessica said simply. "Thank you for being patient with me while I figured it out," Sarah replied. Senator Tuberville, before leaving for his flight back to Alabama, stopped to speak with Whoopi privately. "Ms. Goldberg," he said, "I want you to know that what happened here these past weeks gives me more hope for this country than anything I've experienced in politics." "Senator," she replied, "I learned more about myself and about America from this experience than from years of doing political commentary. Maybe that's what we all need to do more of, actually listen to each other." 6 months later, the impact of what became known as the accent conversation was still being felt across the country. Universities had added discussions of linguistic bias to their diversity and inclusion programs. Several major corporations had modified their hiring practices after discovering unconscious accent bias in their recruitment processes. Sarah's nonprofit had received funding to work with media organizations across the country on bias recognition training. Dr. Williams had published a widely read academic paper on the Tuberville moment and its impact on public awareness of linguistic prejudice. Most importantly, thousands of Americans had become more conscious of their own assumptions and biases, leading to countless individual moments of greater understanding and respect between people from different backgrounds. What had started as a brief, uncomfortable exchange on a daytime talk show had become a catalyst for a broader conversation about how Americans treat each other, judge each other, and can do better in building bridges across the regional, cultural, and political divides that often separate them. In her final report on the experience, Sarah wrote, "Sometimes the most important changes begin with the most uncomfortable moments. Our willingness to sit with discomfort, to examine our own biases, and to commit to doing better can transform moments of conflict into opportunities for growth and understanding." The story of Whoopi and Tommy Tuberville became a case study in communication programs across the country, demonstrating how media moments could either perpetuate harmful stereotypes or become catalysts for positive change. What had begun as a 7-second silence in a television studio had rippled outward to touch millions of lives and change countless perspectives. For Sarah Chen, the experience had fundamentally altered her career trajectory. Her nonprofit, Bridging Voices, had grown from a small initiative to a nationally recognized organization working with media companies, educational institutions, and corporate clients to identify and address various forms of communication bias. 2 years after the original incident, Sarah found herself standing in a conference room in Atlanta, training executives from a Fortune 500 company about unconscious bias in hiring practices. Among the participants was David Richardson, a hiring manager who had grown up in rural Georgia before moving to corporate headquarters in the city. "I never realized," David said during one of the training exercises, "how often I've watched colleagues dismiss candidates during phone interviews based on their accents. I always thought it was about cultural fit, but now I see it was something much more problematic. These individual realizations, multiplied across thousands of similar training sessions, represented the true legacy of what had happened on The View that Tuesday morning. The conversation had moved beyond the initial participants to become embedded in how Americans thought about fairness, respect, and inclusion. Whoopi Goldberg had also been transformed by the experience. Her approach to political commentary had become more nuanced, more focused on understanding different perspectives rather than simply challenging them. She frequently spoke at conferences about media responsibility and the power of public apologies when they lead to genuine learning and change. "I spent my career fighting against discrimination," she would tell audiences, "but I learned that sometimes we can be part of systems of discrimination without even realizing it. The key is what we do when we become aware of it." Senator Tuberville, meanwhile, had used the platform the incident provided to become a more effective advocate for his constituents. His town halls on bridging divides had evolved into a bipartisan initiative involving senators from various regions, focusing on finding common ground on issues that affected rural and urban Americans alike. His communications director, Jennifer Walsh, had documented the entire experience in a book titled Grace Under Fire: How Dignity Defeats Division, which became required reading in several political science programs. The academic community had embraced the incident as well. Dr. Patricia Williams' research on linguistic bias had received significant funding, leading to groundbreaking studies on how accent discrimination affected everything from jury decisions to medical care. "What we learned," Dr. Williams explained in a keynote address at the American Linguistic Society, "is that conscious awareness can dramatically reduce unconscious bias. The Tuberville moment created that awareness on a national scale." Perhaps the most touching aftermath came from the personal relationships that had been strengthened by the broader conversation. Sarah and Jessica's friendship had not only been repaired, but had become deeper than it had ever been in college. They had co-founded a scholarship program for first-generation college students from rural backgrounds, helping them navigate academic environments without feeling pressure to abandon their authentic selves. "I used to think that success meant changing who I was to fit in," Jessica reflected during a scholarship award ceremony at the University of Kentucky. "Now I understand that real success means being authentically yourself while working to make environments more inclusive for others." The scholarship recipients represented a new generation of students who were entering higher education with greater awareness of these issues. They arrived on campus, prepared to advocate for themselves and others, armed with knowledge about linguistic rights and cultural respect that previous generations had lacked. Maria Gonzalez, the high school teacher in rural Georgia who had used the original incident as a teaching moment, had seen remarkable changes in her students over the 2 years since. They had become more conscious of their own biases and more confident in their own voices. "My students now call out discrimination when they see it," Maria reported to her school district's diversity committee, "but they also approach people from different backgrounds with curiosity rather than judgment. It's changed the entire culture of our school." The ripple effects had reached into unexpected corners of American society. Military recruiters reported more inclusive practices when working with candidates from different regional backgrounds. Healthcare systems had implemented training to ensure that patient care wasn't affected by accent bias. Even dating apps had added features to help users recognize and combat their own biases about regional differences. But perhaps the most significant change was the hardest to measure: the countless individual interactions that were now handled with greater respect and awareness. Conversations in coffee shops, job interviews, first days at new schools, business meetings, all were potentially different because millions of Americans had spent time thinking about how they treated people who sounded different from themselves. The original 7-second silence had been filled with uncomfortable tension, but the 2 years that followed had been filled with productive conversations, personal growth, and systemic change that made American society more inclusive and respectful. In her final reflection on the experience, written for the Harvard Review of Media and Society, Sarah Chen concluded, "The most powerful moments of change often begin with discomfort. Our choice is whether we use that discomfort to entrench our existing beliefs or to examine them more closely. When we choose examination over entrenchment, when we choose growth over defensiveness, we open the possibility for transformation that extends far beyond the original moment of conflict." The story served as a reminder that in an age of increasing polarization and division, moments of genuine human connection and mutual respect were still possible. They required courage, humility, and a willingness to be uncomfortable in service of something better. Epilogue. 5 years later, 5 years after that pivotal Tuesday morning in Studio 6A, the impact continued to reverberate through American society in ways both profound and subtle. What had become known as the accent conversation was now taught in communications courses, cited in academic papers, and referenced in diversity training programs across the nation. Sarah Chen stood at the podium of the National Communications Conference in Chicago, looking out at an audience of media professionals, academics, and activists. At 33, she had become one of the most recognized voices in bias awareness training, her organization Bridging Voices, now operating in 47 states. 5 years ago, she began her keynote address. "I was a 28-year-old production assistant who thought I understood prejudice and discrimination. I learned that day that awareness is not a destination, it's an ongoing journey." In the audience sat Dr. Patricia Williams, whose research had expanded far beyond linguistic bias to encompass what she termed the geography of judgment, how Americans made assumptions about each other based on regional origins, speech patterns, and cultural markers. Sarah's work has shown us, Dr. Williams would later tell a reporter, that individual transformation can scale to societal change when the right conditions exist. The accent conversation created those conditions. The conference was being live-streamed, and among the viewers was Jessica Hartwell, formerly Jessica from Kentucky, who was now running for the state legislature on a platform of educational equity and rural representation. She had kept her accent, her values, and her determination to ensure that other young people from rural backgrounds wouldn't face the same challenges she had encountered in college. "Sarah," Jessica had texted that morning, "watching you speak to thousands of people about the importance of authentic voices reminds me why our friendship matters so much. You didn't just learn to accept my accent, you learned to hear my voice." Meanwhile, in Montgomery, Alabama, Senator Tommy Tuberville was preparing for what would be his final press conference as a senator. At 74, he had decided not to seek re-election, choosing instead to focus on the Southern Leadership Institute, a non-partisan organization he had founded to bridge regional and cultural divides in American politics. Jennifer, he said to his longtime communications director, who had agreed to help him transition the institute to full operation. "When this all started 5 years ago, did you ever imagine it would lead to this?" Jennifer Walsh, now considered one of the most skilled crisis communications professionals in Washington, smiled as she reviewed his remarks. "Senator, I've learned that the most important changes often begin with the most unexpected moments. What you did that day, responding with grace instead of anger, that set the tone for everything that followed. The Institute had become a model for how political figures could engage across party lines. Its signature program brought together elected officials from different regions for week-long intensive workshops on finding common ground. The waiting list for participation stretched months into the future. Whoopi Goldberg, now 69, had evolved into what many considered the elder stateswoman of responsible media commentary. Her approach to political discussion had been fundamentally altered by the experience, emphasizing listening and understanding rather than simply winning debates. That morning, she was recording a special episode of her podcast, Learning to Listen, which had become one of the most downloaded political discussion shows in the country. Her guest was Senator Elizabeth Warren, and the topic was how political figures could acknowledge mistakes and grow from them publicly. "Whoopi," Senator Warren said during their conversation, "what you did 5 years ago, taking responsibility, learning, and then using that platform to educate others, that's become a template for how public figures can handle accountability in the social media age." "Elizabeth," Whoopi replied, "I learned that my platform came with responsibilities I hadn't fully understood. When you have millions of people listening to you, every word matters. Every assumption you make or don't make can ripple out in ways you never anticipated." The conversation was being recorded in the same building where The View was produced, though in a different studio. The original Studio 6A had been renamed the Bridging Voices Studio, in recognition of how that space had become the birthplace of a national conversation about respect and understanding. Marcus Thompson, the former social media coordinator who was now the show's executive producer, often brought new staff members to see the studio. "This is where we learned," he would tell them, "that our job isn't just to create content, it's to create content that makes society better." The impact had spread far beyond media and politics. Dr. Amanda Rodriguez, a sociolinguist at Stanford University, had published a comprehensive study showing measurable decreases in accent-based discrimination in hiring practices, medical settings, and educational environments over the 5 years since the incident. "What we're seeing," Dr. Rodriguez explained in her research, "is proof that cultural awareness campaigns can create lasting behavioral change. But it required the right catalyst, a moment that was public enough to generate attention, but handled with enough grace and humility to generate genuine reflection rather than defensive reactions." Her study had tracked the experiences of over 10,000 Americans from various regional backgrounds, documenting how they were treated in professional settings before and after the national conversation began. The improvements were statistically significant and personally meaningful. One of the study participants was David Richardson, the hiring manager from Georgia, who had attended Sarah's training session 2 years earlier. He had since been promoted to head of human resources for his company's southeastern region and had implemented what became known as the Tuberville Standard, ensuring that hiring decisions were based on qualifications and character rather than assumptions about regional backgrounds. "I keep a photo on my desk," David explained to Dr. Rodriguez during his interview, "of my grandfather, who was a brilliant engineer but spent his whole career being underestimated because of his thick rural accent. I never want to be part of a system that would have dismissed him based on how he sounded." The personal stories that emerged from Dr. Rodriguez's research painted a picture of transformation that went beyond policy changes to fundamental shifts in how Americans related to each other. Maria Santos, the teacher from Boston whose grandmother had faced discrimination for her Portuguese accent, had become a leader in her school district's efforts to celebrate linguistic diversity. Her classroom now featured a voice wall, where students shared stories about their own language backgrounds and the assumptions people made about them. "My students understand now," Maria told Dr. Rodriguez, "that their voices, however they sound, carry wisdom and value. They don't need to change who they are to be heard, but they also understand their responsibility to listen carefully to others." The ripple effects had reached into unexpected corners of American culture. Nashville songwriter Rebecca Mills had written a song called 7 Seconds of Grace about the Tuberville moment, which became an unexpected crossover hit, reaching #1 on both country and pop charts. "Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do," the chorus went, "is hold your tongue and find your grace. Sometimes the strongest thing to say is what you don't say in the first place. 7 seconds can change the world if you fill them with the right kind of words." The song had become an anthem for conflict resolution, played at mediation sessions, peace talks, and even wedding ceremonies where families from different backgrounds were coming together. Corporate America had embraced the lessons as well. The accent conversation principles developed by Sarah's organization were now standard components of diversity and inclusion training at over 500 major companies. The principles emphasized curiosity over judgment, listening over assuming, and respect over correction. Tech companies in Silicon Valley had been particularly responsive, recognizing that their global workforce required cultural competency that extended beyond traditional diversity metrics. Engineers from Alabama worked alongside colleagues from India, Ireland, and Iowa, all bringing different accents and perspectives to collaborative projects. "What we learned," explained Sophia Patel, diversity director at a major tech firm, "is that innovation requires diverse thinking, and diverse thinking comes from people who've had genuinely different experiences. When we stopped making assumptions about people based on how they sounded, we started hearing ideas we'd never heard before." The educational impact had been equally significant. The University of Alabama had established the Tuberville Center for Civil Discourse, focusing on how Americans from different backgrounds could engage respectfully across their differences. The center's signature program brought together college students from every state for intensive workshops on communication, empathy, and bridge building. Dr. James Mitchell, the center's director, had documented remarkable changes in participating students. "What we see," he explained, "is young people learning that their regional identity is a source of strength rather than something to overcome. But we also see them developing genuine curiosity about people from other places rather than making assumptions." The center's most successful program paired students from vastly different backgrounds, urban and rural, northern and southern, East Coast and West Coast, for semester-long collaborative projects. The partnerships often resulted in lifelong friendships and business relationships that spanned regional divides. One such partnership had brought together Michael Chen, no relation to Sarah, from San Francisco, and Ashley Williams from rural Mississippi. Initially skeptical of each other, they had collaborated on a project examining how climate change affected different American communities. Their work had led to a joint graduate program and eventually a consulting firm specializing in regional economic development. "Ashley taught me that solutions have to work for real people in real places," Michael reflected. "I taught her about scaling local solutions to national impact. Neither of us could have done our best work alone." The legal profession had also been transformed by the conversation. Several state bar associations had implemented training on accent bias after studies showed that jury decisions could be influenced by attorneys' and witnesses' regional speech patterns. Judge Patricia Morrison of the Alabama Supreme Court had become a leading voice in judicial fairness training. Justice requires that we judge based on evidence and law, not on assumptions about credibility based on how someone speaks, she regularly told new judges during orientation sessions. The healthcare industry had perhaps seen the most critical improvements. Studies had shown that patient care could be compromised when medical professionals made assumptions about intelligence or compliance based on patients' accents. Training programs now ensured that healthcare providers focused on understanding patients' actual words rather than making judgments about their regional backgrounds. Dr. Sarah Kim, an emergency room physician in Atlanta, had implemented what became known as accent-blind patient care protocols. We realized, she explained, that we were sometimes making medical decisions based on unconscious assumptions about patients' ability to understand or follow treatment plans. That's not just unfair, it's dangerous. Religious communities had embraced the conversation as well. The Southern Baptist Convention had passed a resolution encouraging congregations to welcome people from all regional backgrounds without judgment, recognizing that assumptions about someone's faith or character based on their accent violated Christian principles of love and acceptance. Pastor William Johnson of First Baptist Church in Birmingham had become a leading voice in what he called the ministry of listening. His sermons about the Tuberville moment emphasized that true Christian witness required seeing the image of God in every person, regardless of how they spoke or where they came from. Jesus spoke with an accent. Pastor Johnson would remind his congregation, if we're making assumptions about people based on their regional speech, we're missing opportunities to experience God's presence in our communities. The international impact had been unexpected but significant. The story had been covered extensively in international media as an example of how American society could engage in productive self-examination. Several European universities had established exchange programs specifically designed to help international students understand American regional diversity. Professor Hans Müller of the University of Berlin had written extensively about what he called the American Regional Reconciliation Model. His research suggested that other diverse societies could learn from how the United States had used the accent conversation to build bridges rather than walls between different cultural groups. What impressed international observers, Professor Müller wrote, was not that Americans had these biases, every society has them, but that they were willing to examine them publicly and work to change them systematically. As the 5-year anniversary of the original incident approached, all the major participants found themselves reflecting on how the experience had changed their lives and their country. Sarah Chen, preparing for another training session with federal government employees, often thought about that nervous 28-year-old production assistant who had been afraid to speak up in meetings. The confidence she had gained from advocating for what was right had transformed not just her career, but her understanding of her own voice and power. I learned, she would tell trainees, that sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply point out what everyone can see, but no one is saying. That day in the meeting, everyone could see that we had contributed to something harmful. I just had the courage to name it. Senator Tuberville, now enjoying his retirement from politics, but busier than ever with the Southern Leadership Institute, reflected on how a moment of potential humiliation had become the foundation for his most meaningful work. Politics taught me about winning and losing, he told visitors to the Institute, but that day on television taught me about grace and dignity. Sometimes the most important victories come from how you handle moments when someone tries to make you feel small. Whoopi Goldberg, approaching her 70th birthday, had become more thoughtful about her legacy. The accent conversation had taught her that influence came with responsibilities she had never fully appreciated. "I spent my career using my voice to challenge power and fight injustice," she reflected during a recent interview. "But I learned that sometimes I was part of systems that perpetuated injustice without realizing it. The key is staying open to learning, even when it's uncomfortable." Dr. Patricia Williams, now considered one of the foremost experts on linguistic justice in America, had seen her academic work transform into practical policy changes that affected millions of lives. "What we witnessed," she wrote in her latest book, "was proof that academic research and popular culture could combine to create social change. But it required people with platforms to be willing to acknowledge their mistakes, and people with expertise to translate research into accessible education." The 5-year anniversary brought renewed media attention. But the coverage was different from the original incident. Instead of political combat, the focus was on transformation, growth, and the ongoing work of building a more inclusive society. A special documentary, 7 Seconds: How America Learned to Listen, premiered simultaneously on multiple networks, featuring interviews with all the major participants and dozens of people whose lives had been changed by the broader conversation. The documentary's most powerful segment featured a roundtable discussion between Sarah, Whoopi, Senator Tuberville, and Dr. Williams, filmed in the same Studio 6A where the original incident had occurred. "When I watch that original clip now," Whoopi said during the discussion, "I see a missed opportunity that became a found opportunity. I could have let my ego get in the way of learning something important. Instead, I chose to listen to the criticism and figure out how to do better." "What strikes me," Senator Tuberville added, "is how many people have told me over these 5 years that they've tried to handle difficult moments with a little more grace because of what they saw that day. That's worth more than any political victory." Sarah, now confident in her role as a national voice on bias awareness, reflected on the personal journey that had brought her to this moment. 5 years ago, I was afraid to speak up because I thought I might be wrong or might make things worse. Now I understand that staying silent when you see something harmful is actually more dangerous than speaking up and risk being wrong." Dr. Williams provided the academic perspective. What we documented was a society's capacity for rapid, widespread behavioral change when the conditions are right. The key was having people model the behavior, acknowledging mistakes, taking responsibility and committing to growth, rather than simply lecturing about it. The documentary's final segment showed the ongoing impact. Classrooms where students from different backgrounds learned to appreciate rather than judge their differences. Workplaces where hiring decisions were based on qualifications rather than assumptions. And communities where people approached each other with curiosity rather than stereotypes. But perhaps the most moving part was a segment featuring young people who had grown up during the 5 years since the accent conversation began. They spoke with a level of awareness and respect for regional differences that previous generations had never possessed. "I don't understand why people used to make assumptions about others based on their accents," said 16-year-old Maya Patel from California, whose best friend was from rural Texas. "Like, why would where someone's from change what they have to say?" Her friend, Connor Williams from Texas, added, "My dad tells me that when he was my age, people used to think Southerners were dumb or backwards. That's crazy to me. Some of the smartest people I know are from the South, just like some of the smartest people I know are from everywhere else." These young voices represented perhaps the most significant legacy of the accent conversation. A generation that had grown up with greater awareness of bias, more respect for diversity, and better skills for bridging differences. As the documentary concluded, it returned to that original 7-second silence, now filled with 5 years of productive conversation, personal growth, and social change. Sometimes, the narrator concluded, the most important moments in history are not the ones where everything is said, but the ones where everything is held back, giving space for reflection, growth, and grace. 7 seconds of silence became 5 years of listening, and 5 years of listening became a society that learned to hear each other better. The story of Whoopi, Tommy Tuberville, and the 7 seconds that changed American discourse had become more than a media moment or a political incident. It had become a testament to the possibility of transformation, both personal and societal, when people choose growth over defensiveness, learning over winning, and grace over grudges. And it continued to ripple outward, creating new conversations, new understanding, and new possibilities for how Americans could relate to each other across the countless differences that could either divide them or, with the right approach, strengthen them. The silence had ended, but the conversation it sparked would continue for generations to come.